You have refused to cooperate with crew instructions, sir. This is your final chance. Stand up and come with me or I'll remove you.
Before you finish that sentence, I need you to look at something. Boarding pass, seat 2A, and this.
Oh. Sir?
Now, do you want to tell me again that I don't belong in this?
Hashtag racist flight attendant gets black man arrested. Unaware he's FBI. Airline pays $1.2 million settlement. Flight attendant Carol Simmons, employee number 38,847 of Meridian Airways, was conducting her pre-flight walkthrough of the first-class cabin on Flight 1142 from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. when she stopped at row 2 and saw Marcus Ellison, a black man in his early 40s, seated at the window in seat 2A wearing a navy blazer and reading quietly on a tablet. She had been a flight attendant for 9 years. In those 9 years, she had developed a specific and unexamined sense of who belonged in first class and what that belonging looked like. Marcus Ellison did not match it. Without checking the passenger manifest, without reviewing her seating chart, without speaking to a single colleague, and without any observable reason beyond the one she would never say out loud, Simmons approached seat 2A with her arms crossed and demanded to see his boarding pass in a tone she had not used with the businessman in 1A, the retired couple in row 3, or the woman already sleeping in 2C, none of whom were black. When Ellison produced his boarding pass showing seat 2A, first class, paid ticket confirmation number, his name printed clearly across the top, Simmons held it at arm's length like she was examining a document she already believed was wrong, and told him she would need to verify it with the gate agent because something about the booking didn't seem right. She called airport security before Ellison had finished his sentence. Security officer Paul Granger boarded the aircraft 3 minutes later, looked at a valid first-class boarding pass for exactly 2 seconds, and told Ellison that valid or not. The attitude he was bringing to this situation was the real problem. Captain Stephen Marlowe emerged from the cockpit 4 minutes after that, heard 8 words from Simmons, and told Ellison he had 30 seconds to deplane voluntarily before the decision was made for him. What none of them knew was that Marcus Ellison was a 14-year FBI special agent assigned to the Financial Crimes Division, that he was traveling with a laptop bag containing classified case documents, which was the reason he always flew first class on official travel, that 6 passengers had been recording the entire interaction from the moment Simmons crossed her arms at row 2, and that the combination of those 6 recordings, the gate security footage, and Ellison's federal civil rights complaint would produce a lawsuit that settled for $1.2 million, ended Carol Simmons's 9-year career without severance or pension, and became the training case that Meridian Airways now shows every new hire on their first day of sensitivity orientation. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments right now. We love seeing where our community is tuning in from. If you believe purchasing a first-class ticket while black should result in a boarding pass being scanned and a thank you, not a security escort off the aircraft, then like this video and subscribe. Because this story ends exactly the way it should, and the $1.2 million price tag is only part of what Carol Simmons paid. Marcus Ellison had booked seat 2A on flight 11426 days before departure using his personal credit card. Bureau policy covered coach seating on official travel, and Ellison had long since stopped expecting reimbursement for the upgrade. He paid the difference himself, $1,380, because 14 years of carrying classified materials through commercial airports had taught him that first class was not a luxury on work trips. It was an operational necessity. The privacy of a window seat in a forward cabin, away from the high-traffic areas where shoulder surfers and amateur photographers congregated, was the difference between reviewing sensitive case documents safely and leaving them unreviewed until he reached a secured office. He had made that calculation on every work flight for the past 6 years. He had never once been reimbursed for it. He had never once complained about that. At 43 years old, Ellison was a supervisory special agent heading a 4-person team in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, currently working a complex money laundering investigation that had been active for 11 months and involved 3 countries, 2 shell company networks, and 1 very careful subject who had so far managed to stay exactly 1 step ahead of every approach they had tried. The briefing documents in Ellison's laptop bag represented the current state of that investigation, where it had been, where it was going, and what the team needed to do in the next 30 days to close the gap. He had 40 minutes of flight time planned for that review. He had color-coded his annotations the night before. He boarded at 6:40 in the morning, 40 minutes before departure. He found seat 2A, stowed his laptop bag in the overhead bin directly above his seat, settled into the window position, and opened the encrypted case file on his tablet. He was 3 pages in when Carol Simmons reached row 2. Carol Simmons had been a Meridian Airways flight attendant for 9 years. Her personnel file, which the airline's legal team would spend 3 painful weeks reviewing after the lawsuit was filed, contained 4 prior complaints. 2 from black passengers alleging differential treatment in the first-class cabin. 1 from a Hispanic passenger alleging dismissive service in economy. 1 internal complaint from a junior colleague who had reported that Simmons made comments in the crew lounge about certain types of passengers who booked premium seats. All 4 complaints had been reviewed by Meridian's HR department. All 4 had been classified as unsubstantiated and closed without action. 1 HR supervisor had written in a review note that Simmons was an efficient and experienced crew member whose customer service record was otherwise strong. That note had been written 8 months before Flight 1142. Simmons reached row 2 at 6:53 in the morning and stopped. She looked at the businessman in 1A white suit, laptop already open, familiar type. She looked at the elderly couple settling into row 3 white, cardigan, small carry-on, familiar type. She looked at the woman in 2C already arranging her neck pillow, white, business casual, noise-canceling headphones, familiar type. Then she looked at seat 2A, a black man in a navy blazer, khaki trousers, reading on a tablet, quiet, still, doing nothing that required any response from any member of the flight crew. Simmons stopped walking, crossed her arms, approached. "Excuse me." Her voice carried an edge that the businessman in 1A registered immediately. He glanced over from his laptop without turning his head fully. "I need to see your boarding pass." Ellison looked up from his tablet. He had been asked this question before. Not in economy, where boarding pass checks were routine and uniform. In first class, where they were neither. He recognized the specific quality of the request, the crossed arms, the positioning, the tone that was not used with 1A or row 3. He recognized all of it. He reached into the seat pocket in front of him and produced his boarding pass without comment. Simmons took it, studied it the way a person studies a document they are hoping will contain an error, turned it over, checked the barcode, read the name, read the seat assignment, read the confirmation number, looked up. "Is this your ticket?" she asked. "Your personal ticket?" "Yes," Ellison said. "You purchased first class specifically?" This wasn't an upgrade from another cabin. The businessman in 1A had stopped pretending to look at his laptop. "I don't see how the method of booking is relevant," Ellison said, keeping his voice level. "That is my assigned seat. The boarding pass is valid. Is there something specific I can help you with?" Simmons's jaw tightened. "First-class tickets on this route are quite expensive. I want to make sure there hasn't been a system error with your booking." "There is no error," Ellison said. "I paid for the ticket. I am in my assigned seat. I would like to get back to my reading." Simmons did not move. She stood at row 2 holding his boarding pass, her mind clearly searching for the angle that the document wasn't providing. The woman in 2C had opened one eye. A man in row 4 had his phone out. "I'm going to need to verify this with the gate," Simmons said finally. "You have my boarding pass in your hand," Ellison said. "Everything that requires verification is printed on it." "I'll be right back," Simmons said. She turned and walked to the front galley. Ellison watched her go. He closed his tablet. He had learned, over 14 years in federal law enforcement and 4 decades of existing as a black man in spaces where his presence was routinely questioned, to recognize the difference between a situation that was going to resolve itself and a situation that was going to require him to resolve it. This was the second kind. He could feel it in the specific weight that settled in his chest when Simmons turned on her heel, the weight of knowing that what came next was going to be worse than what had just happened, and that there was nothing he had done or could do to prevent it, because the thing driving it had nothing to do with him. At the front galley, Simmons picked up the intercom phone and called the gate. Security Officer Paul Granger boarded Flight 1142 at 6:58 in the morning. He was a 10-year airport security veteran, and he had responded to enough passenger disputes to have developed his own version of pattern recognition, a quick assessment of who was the problem and who was the solution that he made in the first 4 seconds of arriving on scene. When he reached row 2 and saw Simmons standing with her arms crossed and Ellison seated calmly with his hands visible in his lap, Granger's 4-second assessment produced its conclusion before he had spoken a word. "Sir," Granger said, directing his opening statement at Ellison with the tone of someone who has already decided. "What seems to be the issue here?" "I'm sitting in my assigned seat," Ellison said. "This flight attendant has questioned my boarding pass twice without identifying any specific problem with it. The boarding pass is valid. There is no issue." Granger held out his hand. Ellison gave him the boarding pass. Granger looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. Name, seat, flight number, confirmation. Everything correct. He handed it back. "Even with a valid pass," Granger said, "you don't get to create a disturbance in the cabin." The woman in 2C sat up fully. The man in row 4 raised his phone. "I have not created a disturbance," Ellison said. "I have been sitting in this seat reading. Ask anyone in this cabin." "He hasn't done anything," the businessman in 1A said, not looking up from his laptop but speaking clearly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "He's been sitting there since he boarded." She approached him. "Sir, I'm not asking for passenger commentary," Granger said. "You should be," the woman in 2C said, "because we all watched this happen." Granger turned to her with a look that made her lean slightly back. "Ma'am, keep out of this or you'll be asked to deplane as well." Ellison looked at Granger steadily. "You have examined my boarding pass. It is valid. You have been told by multiple witnesses that I have done nothing disruptive. On what basis are you continuing this interaction?" Granger's expression hardened. "On the basis that a crew member has flagged a concern, and it's my job to address it." "The concern has been addressed," Ellison said. "The boarding pass is valid. The concern is resolved." "I'll decide when it's resolved," Granger said. Captain Stephen Marlowe appeared from the cockpit at that moment, drawn by the rising volume of the cabin conversation. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, 32 years of commercial aviation behind him, and he carried the specific authority of someone who had never once had that authority seriously challenged at 35,000 feet. He looked at the scene, Simmons, Granger, and a black passenger in 2A, and made his assessment in the same 4 seconds Granger had used. "What's happening back here?" Marlowe asked, directing the question at Simmons. "This passenger is refusing to cooperate with crew instructions," Simmons said. Marlowe looked at Ellison. "Sir, if my crew has asked you to—" "Your crew asked to see my boarding pass," Ellison said, his voice rising slightly but remaining controlled. "I showed it. It is valid. Your crew then called security. Security examined the same valid boarding pass. I have been asked no lawful instruction that I have refused to follow. I have been sitting in this seat for 18 minutes doing nothing. I need you to tell me what specifically I am being asked to do and why." "Captain," the businessman in 1A said, standing up from his seat, "I'm an attorney. I have been in this cabin since boarding. This passenger has done nothing. Your flight attendant approached him differently than she approached every other passenger in this cabin. I watched it happen. Everyone up here watched it happen." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "Sir, I need you to sit down. And I need you to listen to what I'm telling you before this becomes significantly more expensive than it needs to be," the attorney said. He did not sit down. Ellison reached up to the overhead bin and opened it. Granger's hand moved to his belt. But Ellison was not reaching for anything threatening. He was reaching for his credentials. He pulled them out of the front pocket of his laptop bag, turned back to the cabin, and held them up where every person in row 1 through 4 could see them clearly. "My name is Marcus Ellison," he said. "I am a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. I have been with the Bureau for 14 years. I paid $1,380 for this seat with my personal credit card because I need the privacy to review classified case documents during the flight. I have violated no airline policy, no federal regulation, and no reasonable standard of passenger conduct. I am being removed from this aircraft because your flight attendant looked at me and decided I did not belong here. And every phone in this cabin has been recording since she crossed her arms at row 2. The first-class cabin went completely silent. Carol Simmons's face lost its color in the span of 2 seconds. Granger's hand dropped from his belt. Marlowe stood frozen at the cockpit entrance with the expression of a man watching a mistake he cannot undo finish completing itself in real time. Gate Supervisor Henrietta Cross boarded the aircraft 4 minutes later. She had 22 years with Meridian Airways, and she had been called to enough escalated passenger situations to recognize a career-ending disaster from the jet bridge before she reached the cabin door. When she walked into first class and saw a black man in 2A holding FBI credentials while 6 phones were raised and a standing attorney was describing everything he had witnessed to no one in particular, she knew she was not here to resolve a passenger dispute. She was here to perform damage control on something that had already happened and could not be undone. Everyone who is not a seated passenger or crew member needs to leave this aircraft immediately, she said. She looked at Granger. That includes you. She looked at Simmons. You. Now. Report to my office and do not speak to anyone on the way. Simmons walked off the aircraft without speaking. 6 years later, she would describe those steps down the jet bridge as the longest walk of her life. They were also, effectively, the last steps of her career. Cross turned to Ellison. She looked at his credentials. She looked at his boarding pass, still sitting in his lap where he had placed it after Granger returned it. She looked at the recording phones around the cabin and understood with complete clarity that every second of what she said next was being preserved. "Mr. Ellison," she said. "Special Agent Ellison. On behalf of Meridian Airways, I want to express my sincere and complete apology for what you have experienced on this aircraft today. This is not acceptable. This will not be treated as acceptable." Ellison looked at her for a long moment. "3 things," he said. 1. This flight departs on time and I am on it. 2. Every recording on every phone in this cabin is preserved and provided to my attorney before the end of today. 3. I want the complete complaint history for that flight attendant on my attorney's desk before I land in Washington. Cross nodded. All 3. Flight 1142 departed 41 minutes late. By the time it landed in Washington, the first recording had 4 million views. By the following morning, 11 million. Within 72 hours, Carol Simmons had been terminated by Meridian Airways for violation of company non-discrimination policy and federal civil rights law. After 9 years of service, she received no severance, no pension consideration, and a termination letter that her HR department had clearly written with one eye on the federal complaint already being drafted. Paul Granger was suspended pending investigation. An internal review of his stop history over 10 years revealed a pattern of differential treatment toward minority passengers in escalated cabin situations that resulted in his termination 4 weeks later. Captain Stephen Marlowe was suspended for 30 days and demoted from international routes pending a mandatory bias retraining program. His 32-year career did not end, but it was permanently marked by what he had chosen to do in 4 seconds at the cockpit door of Flight 1142. Attorney Diana Osei filed the federal civil rights lawsuit 19 days after the flight. The complaint was 38 pages and sought $1.2 million in damages. It named Carol Simmons individually, Meridian Airways institutionally, and airport security contractor Pacific Ground Services for Granger's conduct. The complaint documented the 4 prior complaints in Simmons's file and the airline's systematic failure to act on any of them. It documented the differential treatment, the crossed arms, the tone, the specific questions about how Ellison had purchased his ticket that were asked of no other passenger in the cabin. It documented Granger's dismissal of multiple witnesses. It documented Marlowe's 4-second decision. Meridian Airways reviewed the 6 passenger recordings, the gate security footage, and the complaint simultaneously with their legal team over 1 weekend. On Monday morning, they called Osei's office and asked about settlement terms. They did not want a jury to watch a flight attendant question an FBI agent's right to sit in a seat he had paid for while 6 witnesses recorded and a standing attorney narrated. There was no version of that trial that Meridian could survive in front of 12 people. They settled for the full $1.2 million 6 months after the complaint was filed. The settlement required mandatory anti-discrimination training for all cabin crew members within 90 days, an independent audit of all passenger complaints filed over the previous 7 years, sorted by race of the complainant, a zero-tolerance policy for differential treatment in premium cabin service, and the creation of a passenger advocacy office with authority to investigate complaints independent of the standard HR process. The audit produced by that 7-year review identified 31 complaints from minority passengers alleging differential cabin treatment. 29 had been closed without action. The 2 that had resulted in any response had each produced a written warning that went into a file and was never referenced again. Carol Simmons was 37 years old when she was terminated. She had 9 years of aviation experience and a termination letter that any background check would surface immediately. She never worked in commercial aviation again. She took a position in retail management 14 months after her termination at a salary that represented less than half of what she had earned with Meridian. The recordings from Flight 1142 followed her to every job application, every social media search, every conversation in a new city where someone eventually recognized the name. Marcus Ellison continued his FBI career. The money laundering investigation he had been flying to work on when Carol Simmons crossed her arms at Row 2 produced 3 federal indictments 11 months later. He was promoted to unit chief the following year. He still flies first class on work trips. He still pays the difference himself. He no longer carries any expectation that the flight will be uneventful, but he carries his credentials in the front pocket of his laptop bag, where they are accessible in under 4 seconds, and he has not needed to reach for them since Flight 1142. He used a portion of his settlement to fund legal support for minority passengers facing documented discrimination in commercial travel, a quiet contribution to a fund that does not carry his name. Publicly, made by a man who has always preferred to do his most important work without an audience. The lesson requires very few words. A man bought a ticket. He sat in his seat. He read his documents. He was questioned, threatened, and nearly removed from an aircraft he had paid to be on. Not because of anything he did, but because of what he looked like doing it. For prior complaints. 9 years. Zero accountability. Until 6 phones were raised and the credentials came out of the laptop bag. $1.2 million. 3 careers ended or permanently damaged. 31 complaints reviewed. 29 failures of institutional responsibility exposed and forced into the public record. It should not require FBI credentials and 6 recordings to receive the seat you purchased. It keeps requiring them because the complaints keep getting closed and the flight attendants with 4 flags in their files keep being called efficient until the morning they picked the wrong passenger. At Row 2. If you believe a boarding pass should be enough, share this story with everyone who needs to understand what happens when institutions protect their employees from accountability until accountability becomes unavoidable and public and expensive. What reforms would force airlines to treat passenger discrimination complaints with the same seriousness they treat safety violations? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe that first class should mean the same thing regardless of who is sitting in the seat, subscribe. Because we are not finished until Carol Simmons's termination letter is the policy and not the exception.